I still have a small, jagged piece of scrap metal sitting in my top drawer, right next to my discharge papers, and a photo of a girl I used to know in Ohio. It doesn't look like much to anyone else, just a rusted triangular shard of a German beach obstacle. But to me, that piece of metal represents the difference between me sitting here at 92 years old and me being buried under a white cross in France back in 1944. The brass told us it was a violation of the manual. They called it unauthorized tampering with government property. They even threatened to court-martial the man who dreamed it up. But in the end, that illegal modification didn't just save my life. It changed the way we fought the war. We were stuck in the bocage, that nightmare stretch of Normandy where the hedgerows are thicker than a man's waist and older than the country we were fighting for. You see, the maps didn't show the hedgerows for what they really were. We thought they were just bushes, something you could push through or jump over, but they were walls, earth and stone held together by tangled roots that had been growing for 1,000 years. And the Germans, they knew exactly how to use them. Every field was a kill zone, every corner was a trap. Our tanks, those big Shermans we relied on, were useless. When a tank tried to climb over a hedgerow, its nose would point straight up at the sky, exposing that thin belly armor. The Germans would just sit there with a Panzerfaust and wait for the show. I remember sitting in a ditch near St. Lo, watching a whole platoon of our boys get chewed up because we couldn't get through the greenery. The smell of burning diesel and wet earth is something that never leaves you. It's a heavy, cloying scent that stays in the back of your throat for decades. We were losing men by the hundreds, and the guys in the high-backed chairs back in England kept telling us to follow the doctrine. They wanted us to use explosives to blow holes in the hedges, but that just alerted every German within 5 miles that we were coming. It was a suicide mission, plain and simple. There was a mechanic in our unit, a fellow named Curtis. He wasn't even supposed to be with the infantry, but things were so chaotic after the landings that people ended up where they were needed, not where they were assigned. Curtis was a quiet man, always had grease under his fingernails and a cigarette hanging out of the corner of his mouth. He'd been a tinkerer back in civilian life, the kind of guy who could make a tractor run on prayer and moonshine. He spent his nights staring at those hedgerows and then staring at the front of our tanks. He'd mutter to himself, sketching things in the dirt with a stick. One night, I found him huddled over a pile of scrap metal we'd hauled back from the beaches, those big Czech hedgehogs the Germans had used to stop our landing craft. He had a welding torch he'd scavenged from a downed repair truck, and the blue light was flickering against his goggles. He looked like a ghost in the dark. I asked him what he was doing, and he just pointed at a Sherman sitting nearby. "The army says we have to go over," he whispered, his voice raspy from the smoke. "I say we go through." He was welding these big, ugly steel teeth onto the front of the tank. They looked like something out of a nightmare, jagged and sharp. He told me that if the tank had enough bite, it wouldn't climb the hedge. It would cut right through the roots and the dirt, staying level so the gunner could actually see what he was shooting at. It was brilliant, and it was completely against every regulation in the book. A lieutenant came by about an hour later and nearly had a heart attack. He told Curtis to stop immediately, saying he was destabilizing the structural integrity of a multi-$1,000 machine. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Curtis didn't stop though. He waited until the lieutenant moved on, and then he went right back to work. He knew, just like I knew, that the manual wasn't the one dying in the dirt. We needed a miracle, and we didn't care if it was authorized or not. He worked through the night, his hands shaking from exhaustion, but his eyes focused. By dawn, he had one tank finished. It looked like a prehistoric monster with those steel tusks welded to its nose. The crew of that tank, guys I'd shared coffee with just the day before, looked at it with a mix of hope and terror. We moved out at 600. The air was cold and damp, that French mist that settles into your bones. We reached the edge of a field that we knew was crawled with Germans. Usually this was where we'd stop, wait for the engineers to set charges, and pray we didn't get picked off while they worked. But the commander of that modified Sherman, we started calling it the Rhino, didn't stop. He gave it the gas, and that engine roared like a wounded beast. I held my breath as the tank hit the first hedgerow. I expected it to tilt up, to show its belly like all the others, but it didn't. Those steel teeth bit deep into the ancient earth. There was a sound like a giant tree snapping, a groan of roots being torn from the ground, and suddenly, the Sherman burst through the other side. It didn't climb. It exploded through the hedge, leveling it. The German MG-42 nest on the other side didn't even have time to traverse their weapon. They were expecting us to be stuck on top of the hedge, and instead, we were in their laps. I followed that tank through the gap, my M1 Garand tight in my hands. For the first time in weeks, we weren't the ones being hunted. We were the ones doing the hunting. We cleared that field in 10 minutes. Usually it would have taken all day and cost us a dozen men. I looked back at the gap in the hedge, and I saw Curtis standing there, his face covered in soot, just nodding once. He'd done it. He'd broken the stalemate with a pile of illegal scrap metal. But the brass didn't see it that way at first. When word got back to headquarters that a mechanic was defacing equipment, they sent a colonel down to investigate. I remember that colonel. He had a uniform that was too clean and boots that had never seen a day's worth of mud. He stood in front of Curtis and read him the Riot Act. He talked about uniformity of equipment and standardized combat procedures. He actually used the word vandalism. It was infuriating. Here we were, finally winning, and this man was worried about the paint job on a tank. Curtis just stood there and took it. He didn't argue. He didn't point out the dead boys in the next field over who might have lived if they'd had his vandalism on their tanks. He just stared at his boots. But the word had already spread. Other tank crews were coming by, looking at the Rhino, asking if Curtis could do the same for them. They didn't care about the colonel. They cared about coming home. That night, after the colonel left, it was like a secret society had formed. We started liberating more scrap metal from the beaches. Infantrymen, mechanics, and even a couple of low-level officers who were tired of seeing their men die, all gathered in the dark. We set up a perimeter so no more clean brass would stumble onto us. We became a factory of the forbidden. I spent my night hauling heavy steel beams, my muscles screaming, but I didn't care. Every weld felt like a slap in the face to the people who told us it couldn't be done. We modified 4 more tanks that night. We worked by the light of shaded lanterns, the smell of ozone and burning metal filling the air. It was the most honest work I did during the whole war. There was no glory in it, no medals being handed out, just a bunch of tired men trying to find a way to survive the morning. Curtis was the conductor of that strange orchestra, moving from tank to tank, checking the angles, making sure the welds would hold under the pressure of 3 tons of dirt. The next morning, we launched a coordinated attack. We had a line of rhinos leading the way. The Germans were completely caught off guard. They had built their entire defense around the idea that we couldn't break through those hedges. They had their anti-tank guns sighted in on the gaps in the roads, but we weren't using the roads. We were coming through the walls. I remember the look on one German soldier's face as he scrambled out of a trench. He looked at the tank coming through the hedge like it was a ghost. He dropped his rifle and just ran. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. It wasn't long before the higher-ups couldn't ignore the results anymore. General Bradley himself heard about what was happening. He didn't send another colonel to yell at us. Instead, he sent an order. Every tank in the First Army was to be fitted with the Kulin hedgerow device. That's what they called it officially, naming it after Curtis Kulin. Suddenly, the illegal mod was the star of the show. They even brought in cameras to film it, making it look like it was some grand plan from the top all along. But we knew the truth. We knew it started with a guy who refused to listen to a no that didn't make sense. I remember seeing Curtis a few weeks later. He looked even more tired than before. Now that his idea was legal, they had him working 20 hours a day to oversee the production. He didn't look like a hero. He just looked like a man who wanted a nap. I walked up to him and handed him a chocolate bar I'd saved from my rations. He took it, nodded, and went back to his torch. That modification changed everything for us in France. It turned a slaughterhouse into a breakout. We started moving miles a day instead of yards. The bocage, which had felt like a cage for so long, finally opened up. And every time I heard that sound, that beautiful, violent sound of a tank smashing through a hedge, I thought of that night in the dark, the blue light of the torch, and the man who decided that the rules were less important than the lives of his friends. I think about that a lot now, at 92. People talk about the greatest generation, and they focus on the big battles and the speeches. But the real war, the one I lived, was made of small moments like that. It was made of regular guys using their heads when the people in charge lost theirs. It was about the illegal things we did to stay human in a world that had gone completely mad. There was another time later on, near the German border. We were freezing, our gear was falling apart, and the supply lines were stretched so thin we were lucky to get a hot meal once a week. We'd been told to hold a ridge, but we didn't have any heavy machine guns left that weren't jammed or broken. A mechanic from a nearby airbase, a guy who'd been separated from his unit, showed up with a couple of machine guns he'd salvaged from a crashed B-17. Now, those guns were never meant for ground use. They fired too fast, they got too hot, and they didn't have any mounts that would fit a tripod. The brass told him to scrap them, said they were non-standard and a liability. But that mechanic, he didn't listen. He spent 3 days in a bombed-out garage, machining parts by hand, using bits of wire and old truck springs. He built what we called the Stingers. When the Germans attacked that ridge, they thought they were going up against a depleted infantry squad. They came at us in waves, confident and cold. And then we opened up with those modified aircraft guns. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, a solid wall of noise that just tore the air apart. The illegal guns didn't just hold the ridge, they turned the tide of the entire engagement. Again, the people who told us it couldn't be done were nowhere to be found when the shooting started. I guess that's the thing about war. The people who write the manuals aren't usually the ones who have to read them in a foxhole. I've carried that jagged piece of metal all these years to remind me that sometimes the only way to do the right thing is to break a few rules. It's not about being a rebel, it's about knowing what matters. And what mattered back then was the guy to your left and the guy to your right. I remember one night, right before we crossed the Rhine, we were all sitting around a small fire, trying to stay warm. One of the newer kids, a replacement who couldn't have been older than 18, asked me if I was scared of getting in trouble for all the unofficial gear we had. I looked at him, and then I looked at the Rhino tank sitting nearby, its steel teeth scarred and battered from months of fighting. I told him, "Son, the only thing I'm scared of is not making it home because I followed a rule that was meant for a parade ground, not a battlefield." He didn't quite understand then. He was still young enough to think that the world worked the way it was supposed to. But by the time we reached Berlin, he had a non-standard jacket he'd traded for and a pistol he wasn't supposed to have. He'd learned. We all did. You learn real fast that the most dangerous thing in a war isn't always the enemy's bullets. Sometimes it's the stubbornness of your own side. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember when the war finally ended. We were in a small village in Germany, and there was this strange silence that settled over everything. No more artillery, no more engines, no more shouting. I saw Curtis one last time before we were shipped home. He was packing up his tools, his hands finally clean for the first time in years. He didn't get a parade. He didn't get a chest full of medals. He just got a train ticket back to his small town. I went up to him and tried to say thank you. I tried to tell him that I knew I was only standing there because of what he'd done. He just shrugged and shook my hand. "I just didn't like the way those hedges looked at me, Lawson," he said with a small smile. Someone had to show him who was boss. That was it. No big speech. Just a man who saw a problem and fixed it, regardless of what the higher-ups thought. I sometimes wonder what happened to all those modified tanks. I imagine most of them were melted down for scrap, their illegal teeth turned into refrigerators or car parts. It's funny to think about. Maybe someone out there is driving a Buick that was once part of a Rhino that saved a whole battalion of infantry. I'd like to think that bit of defiance is still out there somewhere, built into the fabric of the world. Looking back now, at 92, I realized that the most important lessons I learned didn't come from the training camps in Georgia or the orientation films they showed us on the transport ships. They came from the men who weren't afraid to be wrong in the eyes of the Army, so they could be right in the eyes of their brothers. That mechanic, that illegal mod, it wasn't just about steel and welding. It was about the human spirit refusing to be flattened by a manual. I've told this story to my grandkids, and they always ask if I was ever punished for the things we did. I tell them that when you win, the people who are yelling at you usually find a way to take the credit anyway, and that's fine. I don't need my name in a history book. I just need to know that I did what I had to do. I need to know that the piece of metal in my drawer means something. It represents a moment when common sense beat out bureaucracy. It represents the lives of men who got to go home and have children and grandchildren because one mechanic decided to ignore a no. That's the real history of the war. Not the maps with the big arrows, but the grease and the scrap metal and the quiet defiance of men in the mud. I hope that wherever Curtis is now, he knows. I hope he knows that every time I see a hedgerow, even the small ones in people's yards here in the States, I think of him. I think of the blue light of the torch and the sound of the roots snapping. I think of the illegal fighter that built a path through the impossible. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember a specific afternoon in late July 1944. The sun was actually out for once, which was a rarity in those weeks. We were moving through a section of the bocage that was particularly dense. The air was thick with the hum of insects and the distant rhythmic thud of artillery. We were following a Sherman that had been fitted with Curtis's teeth. The tank was nicknamed the Equalizer. The sergeant in charge of the tank was a guy named Miller. He was a rough, loud-mouthed man from Chicago who had no patience for anything that didn't help him kill Germans. He'd been one of the first to volunteer his tank for the modification. He told the colonel who complained about it to stuff it where the sun don't shine. He was that kind of guy. We came up to a hedge that was easily 10 feet tall and twice as thick. On the other side, we knew there was a 88mm gun waiting for us. We could hear them over there, barking orders in German, the metallic clink of shells being loaded. Normally, this would have been a death sentence. To get a shot at them, we'd have to find a road, which was surely mined and covered by their sights. Miller didn't hesitate. He keyed his radio and told us to stay back. He revved that engine, and the whole earth seemed to shake. The Equalizer surged forward. When it hit the hedge, the whole thing groaned. It didn't pop up like a cork in water, it dug in. I saw the steel teeth disappear into the foliage, and then, with a violent shudder, the tank punched through. It was like watching a curtain being torn down. 1 second there was an impenetrable wall of green, and the next, there was a hole big enough to drive a house through. The German gun crew was sitting right there, not 30 yards away. They were pointing their gun down the road, waiting for us. They didn't even have time to turn. Miller's gunner let fly with a high explosive round, and that was the end of that. We poured through the gap, and I remember feeling this incredible rush of adrenaline. It wasn't just about the combat. It was about the realization that we weren't helpless anymore. That illegal piece of engineering had given us our lives back. I passed Miller's tank as we moved forward, and he was leaning out of the hatch, grinning like a madman. He gave me a thumbs up, his face covered in the dust of the pulverized hedge. That was the day I realized that the war wasn't going to be won by the smartest generals or the biggest factories. It was going to be won by the guys who could adapt the fastest. The Germans were brilliant at following their own systems, but they struggled when we did something they hadn't planned for. They hadn't planned for a tank that could walk through walls. Later that evening, we were digging in for the night. My hands were blistered from the day's work, and my legs felt like lead. I saw a group of officers standing near the gap we'd made, measuring the width of the hole and taking notes. They looked confused, like they were trying to figure out how to put what they were seeing into a report that wouldn't make them look incompetent for not thinking of it themselves. I just sat there on my helmet, eating a cold can of hash, and watched them. I wanted to go over and tell them that it didn't matter what they put in their report. The dirt was moved, the gun was gone, the boys were alive. That's all the report that mattered. But I kept my mouth shut. You don't get through the war by talking back to officers, even when they're wrong. You get through it by doing your job and keeping your head down. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. There's a kind of loneliness that comes with being 92. Most of the people who were there with me, guys like Curtis and Miller, they're gone now. They took their secrets and their memories with them. I feel like a bit of a ghost sometimes, wandering through a world that doesn't understand what it took to get here. People look at the history books and they see the polished version, the version that fits neatly on a shelf, but the real version is messy. It's illegal welds and stolen scrap metal. It's mechanics working in the rain and soldiers breaking rules to save their friends. It's the jagged piece of metal in my drawer. I hope that by telling this, I'm putting a little bit of that truth back into the world. I'm not a hero. I was just a corporal who saw a better way and lived to tell the tale. I remember when we finally got out of the bocage and into the open country of France. It felt like we'd been released from a cage. We could see the horizon again. We could move. The Rhino tanks were still with us, their teeth now a standard part of their silhouette. They didn't look like vandalized equipment anymore. They looked like the future. And as we rolled toward Paris, I realized that the spirit of that modification had stayed with us. We were more flexible, more willing to try things that weren't in the manual. We'd learned that the manual was just a suggestion, and that the real world required something more. I think that's what America was back then, a place where people knew how to fix things, where they didn't wait for permission to be great. I'm tired now. My voice isn't as strong as it used to be, and the memories sometimes get tangled up like those old hedgerow roots. But I'm glad I shared this. I'm glad I could talk about Curtis and the equalizer, and the night we decided to be criminals so we could be soldiers. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember one final thing about that time. It was right before the liberation of a small village. We were stopped on a ridge, looking down at the stone houses and the church steeple. A group of French civilians came out to meet us, their faces lined with years of occupation. They looked at our tanks, and they reached out to touch those steel teeth. They didn't know they were illegal. They didn't know about the kernels and the regulations. To them, those teeth were the jaws of freedom. They saw them as the tools that had broken the walls of their prison. And in that moment, seeing a young girl tuck a flower into the gap where the weld met the hull, I knew that Curtis had done more than just save a few infantrymen. He'd given people hope in a way that no regulation ever could. That's why I keep that piece of metal. Not because I'm proud of the war. War is a terrible, hollow thing. But because I'm proud of the people who fought it with their hearts and their minds. I'm proud of the illegal mods and the men who made them. I hope that when you look at the world today, you remember that sometimes the best things are the ones that someone told you not to do. I'm going to close my eyes for a bit now, but I'll be here. 92 years of memories still burning like that welder's torch in the French night. Thank you for listening to an old man. It means more than you know. I remember the first time we saw a Stinger in action. It was later that fall, as the rain started turning into a cold, biting sleet that made everything, our clothes, our rifles, our very souls, feel heavy and damp. We were pushing toward the German border, and the resistance was getting stiffer. The Germans weren't just retreating anymore. They were digging in, fighting for every inch of soil like it was their last breath. We were low on everything: ammo, food, and especially firepower. Our standard light machine guns were prone to jamming in the mud, and they just didn't have the rate of fire to suppress the kind of entrenched positions we were running into. That's when we met a guy named Silas. He was an ordnance tech who'd been attached to the 5th Armored, but he had a habit of wandering over to our infantry lines to see what we needed. He was a tall, skinny kid from West Virginia, looked like he hadn't had a square meal since the Great Depression started, but he had hands that could fix anything. One day, he showed up with a crate full of AN-M2 aircraft machine guns. These were the guns they put in the wings of P-51s and the turrets of B-17s. They fired 1,200 rounds a minute. That's double what our ground guns could do. The brass, of course, hated the idea. They said the guns would vibrate themselves to pieces, that we couldn't carry enough ammo to keep them fed, and that they were unfit for infantry deployment. Our Silas didn't care about unfit. He spent a week in a muddy shed, using parts from wrecked jeeps and bits of hardware he'd scavenged from a French blacksmith shop. He built these custom cradles and shoulder stocks, and he even figured out a way to use the spade grips from a downed bomber. It was another one of those illegal mods that the officers pretended not to see until they needed it. I'll never forget the sound of that thing going off for the first time. We were pinned down in a turnip field by 2 German MG-42s. Those German guns had a high rate of fire. They called them Hitler's buzzsaw, and they were keeping our heads so low we were eating dirt. Silas crawled up next to me, dragging one of his Frankenstein guns. He winked at me, adjusted the bipod he'd made from a discarded ladder, and pulled the trigger. It wasn't a tat-tat-tat sound, it was a roar. It sounded like the sky was being ripped in half. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. That Stinger chewed through the stone wall the Germans were hiding behind like it was made of dry crackers. In 10 seconds, the German fire stopped. There was nothing left of their position but dust and splinters. Silas just patted the receiver of the gun, which was smoking like a chimney, and said, "She's a hungry girl, Lawson. You better help me carry the belt." We ended up carrying 3 times the normal load of ammunition just to keep those Stingers running, but nobody complained. Not when we saw what they could do. It was another lesson that the guys in the rear didn't understand. When you're in the thick of it, standard issue is just a polite way of saying, not enough. As we moved closer to the end of 1944, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just about the fighting anymore, it was about the survival. The weather became as much of an enemy as the Germans. My boots were never dry. I remember taking my socks off one night and seeing my skin looking like white, wrinkled paper. We called it trench foot, and it sent more men home than the snipers did. I used to sit there, rubbing my feet by a tiny candle flame, wondering if I'd ever feel my toes again. You find yourself thinking about the strangest things when you're cold. I'd spend hours imagining the taste of a warm peach cobbler my mother used to make, or the feeling of a dry wool blanket. One morning, we were patrolling a woods near the Belgian border. It was quiet, that eerie, heavy silence that follows a snowfall. I was on point, moving slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows of the pine trees. I saw a flash of gray movement about 50 yards ahead. I dropped to one knee, my thumb flicking the safety on my M1. I waited. The movement happened again. It was a German soldier sitting at the base of a tree. He didn't have his rifle in his hands. He was just sitting there, leaning back, looking up at the trees. I crept closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I could have shot him right then. That was the rule. That was the job. But something about the way he was sitting stopped me. I got close enough to see his face. He was a kid, maybe 16, 17 at most. His uniform was 2 sizes too big for him, and his face was smeared with soot and tears. He was holding a small piece of bread, but he wasn't eating it. He was just staring at it. I realized then that he wasn't a threat. He was a ghost. He'd probably been separated from his unit, lost in the snow, and he'd just given up. I stood up slowly, my rifle still leveled at him. He heard me then. He looked up, and his eyes went wide. He didn't reach for his gun. He just looked at me, and his lower lip started to tremble. He said something in German. I didn't know the words, but I knew the tone. He was asking me to get it over with. I stood there for a long time, the cold wind whistling through the branches. I thought about the equalizer and the stingers and all the ways we'd found to kill more efficiently. And then I looked at this boy. I lowered my rifle. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a tin of K-ration cheese. I tossed it at his feet. He didn't move. He just stared at the tin. I pointed back toward the German lines, toward the east, and I whispered, "Go, get out of here." He didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the cheese, scrambled to his feet, and vanished into the trees without a word. I never told my sergeant about that. He would have called it dereliction of duty. He would have said I was a fool for letting an enemy go. Maybe I was. But 60 years later, I got a letter from a man in Munich. He'd tracked me down through some Veterans Association records. He said he'd been a boy in the woods in 1944, and he'd never forgotten the American soldier who gave him cheese instead of a bullet. He said he'd gone on to have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. That letter sits in the same drawer as the piece of metal. It reminds me that even in a war built on illegal modifications and brutal efficiency, there's still room for a bit of humanity. It's the one thing that wasn't in the manual that actually mattered the most. People ask me if I regret anything about the war. I regret the friends I lost. I regret the things I saw that I can't unsee. But I don't regret that cheese tin, not for a second. The winter of '44 eventually turned into the Battle of the Bulge. That was the darkest time. We were surrounded, outgunned, and freezing to death. I remember being in a foxhole near Bastogne, sharing a single thin blanket with Silas. We were so close together just to keep the heat from escaping. He was whispering about the things he was going to build when he got home. He wanted to design a better heating system for houses, something that didn't rely on wood or coal. He had it all worked out in his head. "Lawson," he whispered, his breath a white cloud in the dark. "Do you think they'll let us keep the tools when this is over?" I told him I didn't think the army let you keep anything but your memories. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Well, they can't take the ideas. They can court-martial a man for a weld, but they can't arrest a thought." That was Silas. He was always looking for the next way to improve the world, even when the world was trying to bury him. Silas didn't make it out of the Ardennes. A mortar shell landed near our hole on the 3rd night of the breakthrough. I survived because I'd leaned forward to adjust my boot. He didn't. I spent the rest of the night sitting next to him, holding his hand as it went cold. I felt like a part of my own brain had been cut out. All those ideas, all those illegal improvements he had in his head, they were just gone. It was the first time I really understood the waste of war. It's not just the lives, it's the potential. It's the things that will never be built and the stories that will never be told. I took one of the small wrenches from his kit before they took his body away. I still have it. It's a tiny thing, rusted now, but it feels heavy when I pick it up. It feels like all the things Silas never got to fix. When the relief finally came and we broke out of the pocket, I felt like a different man. I was older somehow, not just in years, but in the way I saw the world. I didn't care about the medals or the speeches anymore. I just wanted to see the end of it. We pushed into Germany in the spring of 1945. The illegal mods were everywhere by then. We had jeeps with armor plates welded to the sides, tanks with sandbags piled high to stop Panzerfausts, and soldiers carrying all sorts of non-standard gear. We'd become an army of mechanics and scavengers. We were winning not because we were more disciplined, but because we were more creative. We'd taken the American spirit of the garage and the workshop and brought it to the battlefield. I remember crossing the Rhine on a pontoon bridge that the engineers had built in record time. They'd ignored the safe load limits and doubled the cables just to get us across faster. It was another one of those moments where the rules were tossed aside for the sake of the mission. I looked down at the water rushing beneath the bridge, and I thought about how much of this war had been built on unauthorized decisions. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. When we finally entered the concentration camps, that's when the illegal nature of our fighting really felt justified. I don't talk about the camps much. It's too hard. But I will say this. When you see what following orders and strict adherence to the system looks like on the other side, you stop worrying about whether or not you violated a regulation back in Normandy. The German system was perfect in its cruelty because no one ever dared to say no. They followed their manuals to the gates of hell. We, on the other hand, were a mess. We were loud, we were disorganized at times, and we were always tinkering with things we weren't supposed to touch. But we were human. We cared more about our buddies than the books, and that, more than anything, is why we won. It wasn't just the steel and the oil, it was the fact that we were allowed to think for ourselves. I'm 92 now, and I see the world changing. Everything is so standardized now. Everyone is so afraid of breaking a rule or doing something unauthorized. I see the kids today, and they're so focused on their screens and their instructions. I want to tell them, don't be afraid to weld some teeth on your tank. I want to tell them that the best parts of life happen when you step outside the lines. I still go to the garage sometimes. I can't do much anymore. My hands shake too much to hold a torch. But I like the smell of it. The grease, the cold metal, the potential. It reminds me of Curtis and Silas. It reminds me that we're at our best when we're solving problems, not just following directions. I hope that whenever someone sees a rhino tank in a museum, they don't just see a weapon. I hope they see the defiance that built it. My wife, she used to tell me to throw away that piece of scrap metal in my drawer. She said it was just clutter. But she's gone now too, and I'm the only one left to tell the story of what it really is. It's not clutter, it's a piece of my life. It's the reason I'm still here to complain about the weather and watch the birds on my porch. It's the illegal mod that saved America's deadliest fighter, and it's the memory of a time when we were all a little bit more than what the Army said we could be. I think I'll stop here for now. My throat is getting dry and the sun is starting to go down. But if you remember one thing from my rambling, let it be this. The manual is just paper. The people next to you are what matters. And if the manual says you can't save them, well, then it's time to start welding. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the day we got word that the war was over in Europe. We were in a tiny hamlet outside of Munich. The bells in the church started ringing, a sound we hadn't heard in years. We all just stood there, looking at each other. There was no cheering at first, just a profound, heavy sense of relief that the killing was finally going to stop. I looked at the tank parked in the village square, its illegal teeth still caked with German mud. It looked tired, just like we were. We spent the next few weeks as an army of occupation. It was a strange time. We were winners, but we didn't feel like it. We were just boys who wanted to go home and see our mothers. I spent a lot of my time helping the local civilians rebuild their homes. I used those non-standard tools Silas had left behind to fix door hinges and repair roofs. It felt good to use my hands for something other than a rifle. One afternoon, I was working on a barn for an old German farmer. He spoke a little English, and he asked me why I was helping him. I told him that the war was over and that a broken roof was a broken roof, no matter what language you spoke. He nodded and brought me a glass of cold milk. We sat there in the shade of the barn, two enemies who were just two men. He told me about his sons who hadn't come home. I told him about Silas. It was in those quiet moments that I realized the illegal things we'd done, the modifications, the mercy, the defiance, were what allowed us to return to being humans once the uniforms came off. If we'd only been cogs in a machine, we would have been broken when the machine stopped. But because we'd stayed individuals, because we'd kept that spark of American ingenuity and rebellion, we could find our way back to the light. I still think about that 92-year-old version of me sitting here. I'm proud of that kid in 1944. I'm proud that he didn't listen to the colonel. I'm proud that he shared his cheese. And I'm proud that he's still here to tell you about it. The war was a long time ago, but for me, it's as close as the metal in my drawer. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember one night, right as we were preparing to cross into the heart of Germany, I was sharing a foxhole with a guy who wasn't even Army. He was a Navy lieutenant, a forward air controller they'd attached to our unit to help guide the fighter bombers onto target. We called him Anchor, even though he hated it. He was a long way from the Pacific, and he looked just as out of place in the mud as a fish on a bicycle. We were sitting there, passing a flask of something that definitely wasn't government issued, and we got to talking about those illegal modifications I've been telling you about. He told me a story that I've never forgotten. He said that back in the early days of the war, the Navy had this new fighter, the Corsair. It was a beautiful thing, with those cranked wings and that massive engine. But the brass at the Bureau of Aeronautics had a problem with it. They said it was a death trap for carrier landings. The nose was too long, so the pilot couldn't see the deck when he was coming in, and the landing gear was too bouncy. They actually banned it from carrier operations for a long time, relegating it to the Marines on those dusty island strips. But Anchor told me about a mechanic he knew on one of the carriers, a guy who didn't take no for an answer. This mechanic, let's call him Mac, saw that his boys were getting chewed up in older planes because they didn't have the speed of the Corsair. So Mac and a few pilots started doing some unauthorized experiments. They figured out that if they tweaked the oleo struts in the landing gear, using parts they weren't supposed to have, and pressures that were way outside the manual, they could stop the bouncing. And they came up with a curving approach to the landing that the Navy High Command said was aerodynamically unstable. They essentially rebuilt the way the plane was used, right under the noses of the inspectors. They'd hide their modified parts when the bigwigs came through, and they'd lie on their maintenance reports. They were criminals in the eyes of the Navy's paperwork, but they were building America's deadliest fighter. Eventually, the results were so lopsided, the illegal Corsairs were shooting down everything in sight and landing safely, that the Navy had no choice but to adopt the illegal mods as the new standard. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Listening to Anchor that night, I realized that this wasn't just an Army thing, it was an American thing. Whether it was Curtis with his tank teeth, Silas with his stingers, or Mac with his Corsair landing gear, we were a nation of people who believed that the person actually doing the job knew more than the person writing the rules. It made me feel a little less like a cog in a machine and more like part of a grand, messy tradition of defiance. The next morning, the messy tradition continued. We had to take a small town that was being held by a remnant of a SS Panzer division. They had a Tiger tank, the big one, the King Tiger, parked right in the middle of the town square. Our Shermans, even with the rhino teeth, couldn't go head-to-head with the King Tiger. Its armor was too thick and its gun was too long. We were stuck again. Our commander was looking at the map, talking about calling in a heavy bomber strike that would have leveled the whole town, including the civilians we were supposed to be liberating. That's when our motor sergeant, a guy named Greasy Bill, stepped up. He'd found an old German furniture truck in a barn. He and his boys spent 4 hours welding every spare piece of steel they could find onto the front and sides of that truck. Then, they took a bunch of captured German Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets and rigged them to a frame they'd bolted to the truck's roof. They had a wire running from the rockets back into the cab. It was the ugliest, most illegal vehicle I'd ever seen. It looked like a rolling scrap heap. The captain told Bill he was going to get everyone killed and that he was destroying valuable captured material. Bill just spat a stream of tobacco juice and said, "Captain, That truck was gonna rot in that barn. Now, it's gonna be a dragon. We watched from the tree line as Bill and a volunteer driver raced that truck down the main street. The Germans didn't know what to make of it. They didn't fire at first because they thought it was one of their own trucks. By the time they realized it was a Trojan horse, Bill was 50 yards from the King Tiger. He pulled that wire and 6 Panzerfausts went off at once. The explosion was so big, it blew the windows out of every house on the square. The Tiger didn't stand a chance. Its turret was blown clean off. Bill and the driver jumped out of the truck before the Germans could recover and scrambled into a cellar. We moved in behind the smoke, clearing the town in under an hour. We didn't need the bombers. We didn't need to destroy the town. We just needed a furniture truck and a man who didn't care about the proper way to use a rocket. I saw Bill later that day, sitting on the steps of the town hall, smoking a German cigar. He looked at me and said, "Lawson, don't you ever let him tell you what a tool is for. A tool is for whatever gets you home." If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the smell of that town, the smoke from the Tiger, the smell of old stone dust, and the scent of baking bread. Some of the townspeople had come out and were already starting to heat up their ovens. It's a strange thing, how quickly life tries to restart itself in the middle of a war. I sat down with my back against a stone wall, my M1 across my knees, and I thought about Bill and the Dragon truck. It occurred to me that the real secret weapon of the United States wasn't the atomic bomb or the massive factories in Detroit. It was the fact that we had a million guys like Bill and Curtis and Silas. We had a million guys who had grown up fixing their own bikes, tinkering with their father's Ford Model Ts, and finding ways to make do with nothing during the Depression. We were a nation of illegal mechanics. When we finally crossed the border into Germany proper, the terrain changed. It was all deep forests and steep hills. The Germans had these mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, who were experts at fighting in that kind of country. They were picking us off from the heights, and our artillery couldn't get the right angle to hit them. They were tucked into these caves and crevices that were like natural fortresses. We had a radio operator named Sammy. Sammy was a wizard with electronics. He'd been a ham radio hobbyist back in New Jersey. He noticed that the German radios used a specific frequency for their local mountain coordination. He also noticed that we had a bunch of captured German signal flares. Sammy spent a night taking apart 3 of our own radios and 2 German ones he'd found in a trench. He built a device that could intercept the German signal and then, with the push of a button, send out a high-pitched screech that would jam their frequency. But he went one step further. He figured out a way to use the radio's power source to trigger the German flares remotely if they were within a certain range. It was a complete violation of Signal Corps protocol. He was using unvetted frequencies and tampering with specialized electronic components. One night, we were pinned down at the base of a cliff. The Germans above us were calling in mortar fire with terrifying accuracy. Sammy crawled up to the lieutenant and showed him his little black box. "Sir," he said, "I can shut them up, and I can show you exactly where they are." The lieutenant, who was a decent guy named Harris, just looked at the box and then looked at the mortars hitting 20 yards away. "Do it, Sammy. I'll take the heat for the paperwork later." Sammy flipped the switch. Suddenly, the mortar fire stopped. The Germans couldn't talk to their observers. Then, Sammy turned a dial, and 10 seconds later, 3 German signal flares ignited right in the middle of their own positions on the cliffside. They had no idea what was happening. They thought they were being betrayed by their own equipment. Our guys with the stingers saw the flares and opened up. The mountain was quiet 5 minutes later. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Sammy didn't get a medal for that. In fact, when the Signal Corps captain found out about the unauthorized modifications to the radios, he tried to bring Sammy up on charges for destruction of government property. Lieutenant Harris had to spend 3 days arguing with the brass to keep Sammy out of the brig. It was the same old story. The people who were safe in the rear were more worried about the equipment than the men who used it. I'm 92 now, and I look at my hands. They're spotted with age, and the skin is thin, but I can still remember the weight of that M1. I can still remember the feel of the grease on the Rhino tanks. I've realized that my whole life since the war has been a series of illegal modifications. When I came home, I didn't want to work in a factory where I just pushed a button all day. I wanted to build things. I wanted to fix things. I started a small construction business. My neighbors used to laugh at me because I'd use non-standard methods for bracing foundations or insulating roofs. I'd use things I'd learned in the mud of France, how to make something stronger with less, how to see the potential in a piece of scrap. They called me Old Man Lawson and his crazy ideas. But you know what? My houses are still standing. They didn't blow away in the big storms, and they stayed warm when the frost hit. I think about the Navy banned his idea title you mentioned. It makes me think about how many great ideas are currently sitting in a drawer somewhere because some authority said no. It makes me sad for the world. We've become so obsessed with compliance and standards that we've lost that spark of rebellion. We've forgotten that the most illegal thing you can do is think for yourself. There was a moment, right at the very end of the war, near the Elbe River. We were waiting to link up with the Russians. There was this strange, nervous energy in the air. We knew the fighting was almost over, but we also knew that the world was about to change. I was sitting on the fender of a Jeep, watching a group of mechanics trying to fix a broken generator. They were following the manual, step by step, and they weren't getting anywhere. I walked over, took a look at the thing, and saw that the fuel line was kinked in a way the manual didn't account for. I took a piece of wire from my pocket, a piece I'd kept since the bocage, and I bypassed the kinked section. I tied it off with a knot I'd seen a French farmer use. I pulled the cord, and the generator roared to life. The mechanics looked at me like I'd performed a miracle. One of them, a young kid, asked me, "Is that in the book, Corporal?" I just looked at him and smiled. "Son," I said, "the book is for the people who want to know why it works. The wire is for the people who need it to work now." That's been my philosophy for nearly 80 years. It's why I'm still here. It's why I can look back on the war not just as a time of horror, but as a time of incredible, defiant creativity. We weren't just soldiers, we were inventors. We were illegal engineers in an illegal war, and we built a victory out of scrap metal and grit. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember when I finally got my discharge papers. I was standing on the deck of a transport ship, watching the Statue of Liberty grow larger on the horizon. I had that jagged piece of metal from the hedgerow in my pocket, and I had Silas's wrench in my bag. I felt like I was carrying the souls of all those illegal ideas back with me. I promised myself that I would never forget what they taught me. I promised myself that I would never be just another cog. I would always be the guy who looked for the better way, the faster way, the illegal way. And I did. I raised my kids to be the same way. I told them, don't just follow the rules because they're the rules. Follow them if they make sense. If they don't, find a way to fix them. My son became an engineer, and my daughter became a doctor. They both told me that the best things they ever did were the things that weren't in their textbooks. So, if you're sitting there today, feeling like you're stuck behind a wall you can't get over, remember the Rhino tanks, remember the Stingers, remember the illegal mods that won the war. The wall isn't as solid as it looks. You just need to find the right piece of scrap metal and the right place to weld it. I'm an old man now, and I know my time is short, but I'm not afraid. I've lived a life that was unauthorized by the timid, and I've seen the world changed by people who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. I hope that when I'm gone, someone else will find a piece of metal in a drawer and remember that the most important tool you have is the one between your ears. Thank you for sitting with me. It's been a long journey from Normandy to here, but I wouldn't trade a single illegal weld for all the medals in Washington. It's the memories that keep us alive, and it's the defiance that makes us human. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I'll tell you one last thing. A few years ago, I went to a reunion of my old division. There weren't many of us left. We were all in wheelchairs or leaning on canes. A young Army captain was there to give a speech. He talked about strategic doctrine and technological superiority. He used all the big words. When he was finished, he asked if any of us had anything to say. I stood up as best I could, and I pulled that rusted piece of hedgerow out of my pocket. I held it up so they could all see it. "Captain," I said, "strategic doctrine is fine, but it was this piece of junk and a guy with a welding torch that got us through France. Don't ever forget that the best equipment you've got is a soldier who knows how to break the rules." The room was quiet for a second, and then every one of those old men started clapping. They knew, they remembered, and now, I hope you remember too. The illegal mod is what built America, and it's what's going to keep it going. Just keep your eyes open, keep your tools sharp, and don't be afraid to weld.